In the last episode, we examined the reign of Tokugawa Hidetada, son of the great Ieyasu, who had brought an end to the Sengoku Jidai, Japan's iconic age of warring states. Although Hidetada's reign technically had begun as early as 1605, after the retirement of his father, Ieyasu would come to dominate much of the politics of the shogunate until his death in 1616. This only left 7 years for Hidetada as the sole ruler of Japan, until he too would retire in 1623. His time as shogun saw to the continued strengthening of the military government and lessening of Western trade, along with the repression of Christian influence. Now we enter into the time of his son, Tokugawa Iemitsu, the final of the 3 great founders of the Tokugawa Shogunate, who would finish laying the mighty foundations of the Edo Bakufu for generations to come. However, it is here during his reign that we will come to witness one of the most violent conflicts throughout the entire era, and perhaps the greatest revolt Japan would ever see: the Shimabara Rebellion. (1623), 8 years after the end of the Siege of Osaka, a conflict often thought of as the final great clash of the Sengoku Jidai, and 7 years after the death of Tokugawa Ieyasu, perhaps the previous era's greatest leading figure, a man who had established the Tokugawa Shogunate and ushered in a mighty reign of peace and stability to the nation. It was in this year that Tokugawa Hidetada retired from the position of shogun, which he had inherited far back in 1605. He now handed things off to his son, Tokugawa Iemitsu, making him officially the 3rd shogun of the Tokugawa Shogunate, the Edo Bakufu. At the time, Iemitsu would have been only around 19 years old, but history would go on to remember him as one of the Bakufu's greatest shoguns, overshadowing the legacy of his father Hidetada and finishing off the great foundations of the Tokugawa government that had been initiated by his grandfather Ieyasu. Despite this, as retired shoguns tended to do, Hidetada would still hold plenty of sway for the remainder of his life, as we covered in the previous episode. There are many stories about Iemitsu's life, tales that paint a rather bizarre picture of the man who would be the 3rd Tokugawa shogun. He is believed to have enjoyed moments of solitude, often wandering about all on his own, taking every opportunity he could to show off his luxurious lifestyle and fine clothing to other lords. He even delighted in ordering others around to his amusement. And although he had a rather estranged wife and a number of concubines throughout his life, to which he had many children, he also appears to have had a number of homosexual relationships. These details of a lavish life of splendor awarded to him by his birth status don't necessarily inspire the image of a competent and heroic leader of the shogunate, nothing like that of his grandfather Ieyasu, whom he admired greatly. Yet, regardless of how his personal behavior throughout his life seems to appear, his role as a statesman spoke for itself. As I've mentioned, Iemitsu continued to expand upon the systems that both his father and grandfather had been working at to build up the power of the Bakufu. It was his mission to take up the torch handed to him, and to do his duty to his family and to the nation. From this, he would execute a number of laws and reforms that can be viewed as completing the steps towards establishing a regime to stand the test of time. Initially, his first few moves were just ones aimed at strengthening his own position. He had his younger brother and rival, Tokugawa Tadanaga, stripped of his land and later forced to commit seppuku under the claim that Tadanaga was insane. Iemitsu also set about dismissing many of the high-ranking Bakufu officials who had served during the reign of his father Hidetada, and instead replaced them with longtime friends, figures more loyal to him. Finally, in 1635, we see perhaps one of his most important initiatives, as he would revise the Buke Shohato, the code of warrior households, which had been put in place by his predecessors back as early as 1611. It was a document that established the laws of samurai families under the rule of the new shogunate. Ieyasu had initially introduced it, Hidetada had later expanded it, and now Iemitsu had revised it again. Iemitsu's new additions added further explanations of each point, adding more detail, clarity, and structure to the document overall, leaving less room for loose interpretations of rules that were mandated by the shogunate. He also added several additional articles as well, with one being regarded as perhaps the most significant, this being Article 9. This article established a system that came to be known as Sankin Kotai. This was the famous system in which lords were required to take up a residence within Edo every other year, while their families had to maintain it as a permanent residence. Originally, it was just meant to be enforced upon the Tozama outsider daimyo, but in time, it was expanded to encompass all daimyo across Japan, barring the exception of some faraway lords who were allowed to come less frequently. This was a system that had its roots back during the reign of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but here now, it was a powerful tool for the Bakufu, as it ensured the loyalty of all daimyo in a way perhaps more effective than any previous method, as entire families were kept in Edo as hostages by the shogunate. Iemitsu also continued to work on elements of foreign affairs as well, just as his father Hidetada had been doing. Christian influence was repeatedly and increasingly repressed, and Western trade continued to dwindle, especially after the exodus of the English and Spanish from Japan. What remained at this point was still some Portuguese, but mainly now Dutch trade, which continued to flow in from Nagasaki and was increasingly used as a source of great wealth flowing into the country. But as a whole, Japan had realized its new state of peace and security brought about by the Edo period, and from the top, the Tokugawa Shogunate held an unquestionable grip. Yet to say that the Japanese at every level were now prospering would be completely false. And this is where we can still see that at the lowest levels of the common people, there was still plenty of the same amount of poverty and suffering that had existed for hundreds of years. Even without incessant war, much of the lower classes still were suffocated under the harsh face of samurai rule. Now, revolts were a common enough thing in pre-modern Japan. In fact, in years past, there were even attempts made to quell any possibility of them, with Toyotomi Hideyoshi's sword hunt perhaps being the most famous, as it removed weaponry that the peasantry could possess. Further restrictions were implemented by the Tokugawa Shogunate, ones which ensured that each domain remained secure and isolated from one another, an effort which made it difficult for villages to effectively join up and conspire against the government. Despite this, lower-class insurrection was still somewhat common enough, due to all things from natural disasters, crop failures, intense taxation and poverty, and of course various social and political restrictions. It is believed that between 1590 and 1640, some 198 rebellions arose across the country. Yet, throughout the Edo period, the most famous that would occur, perhaps even one of the most famous rebellions in all of Japanese history, would be the Shimabara Rebellion. The island of Kyushu had been a hotbed for tension for many, many years now. Not only was the island hotly contested over during the Sengoku Jidai, but it was also the hub where most European trade and Christian influence entered the country. It was a place in particular where Christianity had come to even flourish. This was in large part thanks to missionary work, and also the conversion of many daimyo and other samurai to the Christian faith. This too had been the cause of much tension, as Christians in Kyushu were recorded to have inflicted much damage upon local Buddhist institutions, so much so that even Toyotomi Hideyoshi is believed to have been taken aback by what he saw in Kyushu following his campaign there in the 1580s. But it is incredibly important to understand that the upcoming Shimabara Rebellion was not one solely started due to any religious aim, despite the fact that the rebels unified themselves under the Christian faith. Rather, the cause of the rebellion was the culmination of a variety of factors, all of which rooted in the harshness of the times. Throughout the 1630s, Kyushu was facing a series of devastating floods and disease outbreaks that further contributed to a wider famine. But to make matters infinitely worse, those in Shimabara were burdened even more by a ruthless overlord. This was Daimyo Matsukura Katsuie. A little over 2 decades prior, Shimabara and Amakusa Island had been under the rule of Arima Harunobu, a Christian lord, who after an incident revolving around him and another Tokugawa official was stripped of his land and sent into exile, where he was later ordered to commit seppuku. Yet he had certainly left his mark on his previous domain, as much of the population had converted to Christianity. The new lords of the area now, the Matsukura, were strictly anti-Christian, and carried out a horrifying inquisition of torture and execution for those who refused to renounce their Christian faith. Yet, this alone was not enough to stir the populace into revolt. The suppression of Christians had already become a common enough thing across the country, and those suppressed had already developed ways of hiding their faith and carrying on in secrecy. What drove the people of Shimabara into revolt was the much more dire situation they found themselves in under the rule of the Matsukura. The Matsukura must have received clearance by the shogunate to construct the fabulous new Shimabara castle. To this, Matsukura Katsuie had enforced crushing taxes and brutal collection methods. A Dutchman located in nearby Hirado recounted what he knew of the poor treatment inflicted upon the peasants. He stated that the lord of Shimabara imposed moreover upon rustic samurai and other farmers more taxes, and forced them to raise such a quantity of rice as was impossible for them to do. Those who could not pay the fixed taxes not only received burns, but some were burned to death. This revengeful tyrant, not content with his cruelty, ordered women to be suspended quite naked by the legs, and caused them to be scoffed at in various other ways. This severe injustice, paired with the famine and the Christian persecution, was all too much to bear. The people of Shimabara were really only left with one course of action: to rise up against the Matsukura. The spark that lit the fuse to the whole rebellion occurred on December 11th, 1637. It was here that after a daughter of a villager in southern Shimabara was atrociously tortured by Matsukura officials, that the populace was riled up into violence. They took their rage to the office of the local magistrate, who they apprehended and killed. This was the point of no return. Had this been the only act of defiance, it would have been met with excruciating punishment from the Matsukura. Instead, the only path forward now was to continue the fight. The murder of the magistrate echoed across the domain, and soon more villages began to take up the cause, as scores of peasants flocked to join in. There was even a good number of former Arima samurai turned ronin who eagerly sided with the rebels as well. In the following days, this ever-growing force marched north to the location of the new Shimabara castle. Unequipped to actually assault the castle itself, they outnumbered and trapped the Matsukura garrison inside, and then turned their attention to the surrounding castle town, to which they burned. Word of the revolt continued to spread, and more villages in the area aligned themselves to the cause of the rebels. Eventually, it even spread to Amakusa Island. While some still resisted the call to action by the rebels, those who were not cooperative were harshly dealt with. The Shimabara rebellion was officially in full swing. The rebels were obviously united by a number of factors, from the awful treatment they had endured to the famine which threatened their very lives, and of course, their suppressed Christian faith. Over the years, there has been no more defining feature of the rebels that has emerged than that they were a united force of Christians. This has often led to the rebellion as a whole getting often dubbed as a Christian revolt. However, that is not entirely accurate to say, despite the fact that yes, the majority of them were Christians and took to heavily identifying their forces as such, erecting ornate Christian banners that bore the symbols of Christendom. Christianity was not the main cause of the revolt, but instead an integral unifying factor in the uprising among all those who chose to rebel. Even the shogunate, upon learning of the insurrection, would come to largely view it as mainly a Christian uprising, which made it appear all the more threatening to them after all these years of trying to rid the country of all Christian influence. This all leads to the rise of one of the rebellion's primary leading figures, that of a young boy named Masuda Shiro, also known as Amakusa Shiro. Sources say he came from a farming family on Amakusa Island, but that he may have also been descended from former retainers of the famous Christian daimyo Konishi Yukinaga. He was only around the age of 16 at the start of the rebellion, but he quickly made a significant name for himself, declaring that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ. This claim would catapult him into being seen as the rebellion's most paramount spiritual leader, and overall, the greatest symbol of the rebel cause. Through Shiro, the rebels were given a greater purpose than just rising up against their tyrannical overlords. Through Shiro, they were given a new sense of salvation, that their fight was a holy one, and that even in death, they would find their way to heaven alongside him. With the revolt now in full swing, the rebels, knowing that there would soon be a response by the shogunate, had to plan their next actions carefully. By this point, estimates of how large the rebellion had grown varies wildly, with some estimates going as high as 50,000 and others as low as 25,000. Being that the number on the lower end is considered to be the more realistic number, that is what we will go with. A force primarily composed of men, women, and children, with perhaps only 12,000 men considered to have been fit for combat. There was also a small portion of former Arima samurai I had mentioned as well, and it is imperative to note just how vital the role of these samurai were, as through their leadership the rebels were able to gain a tactical advantage from experienced veterans. This is what turned the rebellion from simply an unruly mob into an actual legitimate force to contend with. As for their best course of action, the only logical thing to do was to fall back to a defensible position where they could hold out. Fighting a field battle against samurai armies was out of the question, and resorting to guerrilla warfare would have only been more ideal if there was not already an excellent place for them to establish themselves. You see, fortunately for the rebels, they had by far one of the greatest defensive locations they could have ever dreamed for, the now vacant Hara Castle. Hara Castle had previously been the power base of the Arima clan when they were in control of Shimabara. And although the Matsukura had moved their own power base over to the new Shimabara castle, Hara still had a stockpile of weapons and supplies that had yet to be relocated. This meant that when the rebels moved into Hara, they acquired what is estimated to be around 100 bows, 500 swords, 300 pikes, and perhaps as many as 1,400 matchlock firearms. The castle also had some stores of food and a well which provided an endless source of fresh drinking water. There was also a small supply of wood for fire and trees which could be cut for further need. But sufficient stockpiles of supplies and arms were not the only thing that made Hara so ideal. The castle itself was also perfectly positioned, with most of its walls rising up from cliffs that overlooked the surrounding sea. The only exposed portion for any assault to come would be along its northern wall, a place which the rebels could concentrate all of their firepower. And what's more to this is that the rebels also set about restoring and fortifying other portions of the castle as well, further improving its capabilities. So as we can see, the rebels had a number of fantastic factors working in their favor. They had a threatening and sizable force, capable samurai leadership, supplies and equipment, and a truly daunting, defensible position. The task of dislodging them was going to be excruciating indeed. By mid to late December, neighboring cities and provinces had become aware of the rebellion, and soon word had reached the Bakufu itself. To this, Matsukura Katsuie, who was currently spending his state-ordered time in Edo, was commanded to return home to Shimabara to quell the uprising. However, he was not going to be forced or punished to undertake this task alone. Realizing the severity of the situation, surrounding domains would also be called upon to lend their support in putting down the revolt. News of the rebellion must have taken Shogun Iemitsu by surprise. For the past 14 years, he had spent a large portion of his efforts working to expand stability and shogunal control over the nation. His recent reforms to the Buke Shohato and military parades he had taken to showcase the might of the shogunate were done to instill a sense of security across Japan. Yet in order for a revolt of this scale and severity to have erupted, there had to have been a series of reasons that only the local lord could have been responsible for. Famine and disease were a common enough thing in pre-modern Japan, as well as the repression of Christianity. But as we saw, it was the further harsh treatment by the Matsukura that had truly caused things to boil over into the state they were now. It was entirely their fault that the Shimabara rebellion had broken out. However, although it was Matsukura Katsuie's domain and that he was making his hasty return back to it, he was not chosen as the one to lead the entire operation to bring down the rebels. Instead, the overall leader of the operation was to be Itakura Shigemasa, a well-known and trusted figure based on his past experience. He was a veteran of the Siege of Osaka and had worked closely with Tokugawa Ieyasu. It was he, along with Ishigaya Sarakyo, who were ordered to advance as an expeditionary force to march on Hara. To aid them, local daimyo of Hizen were ordered to mobilize their forces to aid in the assault. All in all, it would take until around mid-January for the shogunal forces to fully amass upon the Shimabara Peninsula. Once arrived, they would face their most difficult conflict since the end of the Siege of Osaka, as a large and heavily fortified force stood to oppose them, all united under a common cause and faith, and inspired by a figure who they believed to be their messiah. Still, there is obviously no way that the rebels of Shimabara would be able to hold out successfully against a prolonged siege or assault of Hara. Yet they prepared to fight and die to the last man regardless. And with the shogunate closing in, thousands on both sides were set to perish. We will witness the great siege and climax of this entire conflict in the next episode. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.